And hello, friends. We welcome you to another episode of Chapters here on Armstrong Television. Chapters is the show that profiles authors, editors, and publishers in West Virginia, Ohio, and Kentucky. I'm your host, Eliot Parker, and it's great to have you with us. We are pleased to be joined today by poet, short story, and novella writer Ron Houchin to talk to us about his writing and his career as a writer. Ron is the author of 8 books of poetry, 1 novella, and 1 collection of short stories. Some of his previous poetry collections include Museum Crows, Birds and the Tops of Winter Trees, Among Wordless Things, Movable Darkness, and Death and the River. Ron has traveled throughout Europe, Canada, and the United States. His work has appeared in Poetry Ireland Review, The Stinging Fly, the Southwest Review, Appalachian Heritage, the New Orleans Review, and over 200 other venues. He's been awarded an Ohio Arts Council grant for Teachers of the Arts, a tutorial fellowship to teach in a Dublin writing workshop, a poetry prize from Indiana University, as well as a Book of the Year award from the Appalachian Writers Association, which is the Weatherford Award. And his poems have also been featured on Verse Daily. And we're pleased to have Ron Houchin with us today to talk about his writing and his outstanding career. So, Ron, welcome to the program. Good to have you here.
Thanks, Eliot. It's great to be here.
So, how did all of this get started for you? I know you taught school here in this area for a long time, but how did the writing bug sort of happen, or the writing career really get started for you?
I guess it all begins with a desire, and then turns, if you're lucky, into a kind of reality. I had a junior high school student teacher, who was brave enough and audacious enough to suggest to the class that we write a poem. She said, "Who knows what a poem is?" Only time, I promise you, the only time I raised my hand to the entirety of junior high school at West Junior High School was when she said, "Who knows what a poem is?" And I raised my hand, and she gave us a list of topics for possible themes for the poem. One of them struck me. It was night noises, very kind of romantic, you know. And I remember writing this ridiculous poem. It went on longer than I can remember now, but it was like, "In the night you may hear noises that are odd and queer." So this was like I don't know what year would it have been when I was in the 7th grade, about 1961 maybe. And can imagine, you know, what happened later. I got into a couple fights. In those days, West Junior High School was like the roughest school, middle school in the area. So it was a lesson. But it was the first time I'd gotten any real positive feedback in school. So that started the ball rolling.
Very good.
After that, I wrote sporadically, but by the time I hit college at Marshall in 1966, I was writing pretty regularly.
So started early on in junior high for you.
Yeah.
As you worked with students as an educator, what was that like, and working with students and being involved in that environment? How did that help you? Did that inspire you to write, or how did that influence your writing, working with students and teaching and grading and all the things that come with it?
That's an interesting question. One of the things it did for me is it made me able to practice what I preached. So the students I had were not always the ones who were highly motivated. They were what they used to call the at-risk students, and which I was one of, you know, and I loved them for that. As a matter of fact, it seemed like every time I got in trouble with the administration, I could hear my students in other classes laughing because I went down to the office to see what I'd done now. But the fact also that I practiced what I preached. I would give them a writing assignment, and sometimes I would say, "Okay, when I'm finished, you're finished." And I would always make sure I took longer than anybody in the room, you know. So I was the slowest one in the room to get it done. So, but it was good in that I was probably, I can't say this 100% certain, I was probably one of the few people besides the coaches who practiced what they preached. You know, I taught writing and I wrote. So, of course, when the first book came out in 1997 from Ireland, my stock as a teacher went pretty high. So that was nice.
Very good.
From then on, it was smooth sailing, I guess you could say.
Very good. Excellent. So Your evolution as a poet, kind of, you mentioned that you really got interested in writing all the way back to when you started in junior high at West Junior High. How did you start to really get into poetry, or kind of what was your earliest connections to poetry, both maybe as a reader and as a writer as you got older?
That's interesting. I think initially poetry because I was probably lazy, and somewhere in my mind I thought, oh, this is shorter, it's got to be easier. Wrong. It's twice as hard. I mean, I could write a short story just about any time, about anything, but a poem, I have to kind of fall in love with the world all over again, to be able to do that. And I don't have to do that with prose. So another thing that helped me also was I would tell the class stories, things that I had a pretty wild childhood in Huntington, growing up in the 50s and early 60s. And so I would tell them stories of things that happened to me, slightly embellished, only when necessary for the sake of the story. And they seemed to get a big kick out of that. And the one collection of short stories I've got, Tales Out of School, is basically stories that I told my class. Some of them aren't, but most of them are. And so that was fun. That made it great fun out of the situation. And that was the trick. If I could make it fun for myself, I figured I could at least create an air of fun. So that if it wouldn't be necessarily actual fun, it would be something like fun. It would approximate fun for the students. So.
Excellent, very good. I wanted to ask you about one of your poems, and I'll ask you about some others too, but one that I really like that you wrote, Wintercast for Museum Crows. And I did a little research on crows, and I came to find, after I read your poem, and I came to find that they're pretty intelligent. They're
Yes.
pretty intelligent birds, and they can recognize faces, and they can remember faces, and they have a very good memory, not just for geographic purposes, for getting where they need to go, but they can look at people and remember faces. So tell us a little bit about that poem, about Wintercast, and what got you interested in writing about crows and kind of focusing on that as part of your poem.
Once in the Boy Scouts, when I was in the Boy Scouts here, Troop 42, and we would do a lot of traveling, and we went down to the Smoky Mountains and the Appalachian Trail, and there was a man down there who had a crow, and he had split the tongue of the crow. After I thought it was an old wives' tale, that you could split a crow or a raven's tongue and they could talk. I don't know how that worked, but he had done something, and this crow had a vocabulary of about 40 words. The crow had predecessors that he had also done that with, that he had trained, and he had photographs of them. And some of them, they looked like museum photographs. They'd be beside dusty windows where you could see part way out the window, but you could still see the stuffed crow standing there. I don't know if he was telling the truth or not, but he had verisimilitude in that he had this one crow that could talk. And so that got me started. And then years and years later, it rattled around in there and it came back out. So that's that poem.
Yeah, and I did know that much about crows, or kind of their mental abilities. That was really interesting to see that. I want to ask you about your book of poems, the book of poems that won the Weatherford Award from the Appalachian Studies Association. What was that experience like, and the significance of winning that award for an Appalachian writer? What does it mean to win that award, and what did that mean to you to win that award?
That was an amazing time. That was 2013. The book was one of the books I brought here, The Man Who Saws Us in Half, that has a nice vaudeville-style magician sawing a lady in half on the cover. And I had sent a manuscript to Dave Smith, the Pulitzer Prize finalist, who edited a series for Louisiana State University Press, who published this book. And I had no idea he was the head of a series called that LSU published, called Southern Messenger Poets Series. But I just liked Dave Smith, and I'd met at a workshop from Dave Smith in Indiana, and I read his book, The Wick of Memory, which I thought was excellent. And so I wrote this collection of poems, some of them celebrating Dave Smith, and none of them in imitation, just because I'd gotten so inspired by reading his book. And I sent it to him with a letter or an email saying, Dave, if this ever gets published, I want to dedicate it to you. And this was near Christmas of 2012, 2012, maybe 2011. I can't remember the exact year. And he sent back just a few days later an email to me saying, I have several books here on my desk that I'm supposed to choose one of for the Southern Messenger Poets series, but none of them are really inspiring me. If you'll take that dedication to me off there, I'd like to use it in my Southern Messenger Poets series. Well, that was Christmas Eve, and he's talking about a Christmas gift.
Yeah.
You know, that was great. And then the book came out, and it was submitted by LSU Press to Berea College. That is one of the sites for the Weatherford Awards, and I got word that it had been nominated. Then I got word later that it had won. So then it just so happened that the ASA, the Appalachian Studies Association, which was the other group that sponsors that, was meeting here in Marshall University. So they asked me if I would, be present, and they presented the award, and bingo. That was a great year. I mean, that one year I had 3 books come out.
Wow.
The collection of short stories, The Man Who Sawed Us in Half, and then a collection of another collection of poems from Salmon Publishing in Ireland, The Quiet Jars, which is a new and selected book.
So yeah, I wanted to ask you about the Quiet Jars too, because you mentioned that it came out from an Irish publisher in Ireland. How did you find them? How did you guys get connected in terms of submitting a manuscript to them and developing that relationship?
That also is an interesting story, at least to me. It was in the mid '90s, whatever year the O.J. Simpson trials were on TV. I was in Ireland taking a workshop that Billy Collins, the former poet laureate of the United States, a really interesting fellow and very generous, he was running a workshop there, and he had set up through an Irish lady. The Irish are so open to poetry, and they just love all the arts. And this lady set up a reading for us at the Galway Arts Center, which is near where the workshop was held. And so we all went in, the participants of the workshop. I think it was me and like 17 women. I was like the only guy in the workshop, and of course Billy, and we read at the Galway Arts Center. And I had a couple poems published in Poetry Island Review, and I thought, what the heck, I might as well read those. If I'm going to be reading to the Irish, why not read out to them from one of their magazines? So I read a couple poems that I'd had in Poetry Ireland Review, and of course, like a lot of things in Ireland, after the reading we went around to a pub, and so we went to Brendan's Yard, which is a pub that was around the corner, and in comes this lady, Jessie Lindeni, and she was wearing this slight cape and being led basically by 2 golden retrievers, like some sort of Celtic goddess or something. It was unreal. And I might have had a Guinness or 2 by that time. And later she said, I like what you read. You ought to send me a manuscript. I didn't know at the time that she was the director of Salmon Publishing. And I reached down into my bag and I said, well, I just happen to have, and I handed her a book like the manuscript. And of course I became the laughing stock of the workshop for a day or 2. But a couple years later the book came out in 1997, and bingo. Since then we've had a literary love affair. They've published 4 or 5 of my books and getting ready to publish another one, and I go back every year that I possibly can. So
that's great. That's great.
Yeah,
So we've had some writers on the program that have said, have talked a lot about rejections, and don't let rejections stop you. But we've also had some writers say that sometimes it's timing. Sometimes just being in the right place at the right time, or being in the right workshop, or being at a table with the right people, or the right group, or the right whatever, is important too. And it seems like that worked well for you.
Very much. And of course, what does all that mean? It means perseverance. You've got to keep at it if you want it. If I had never gone to a workshop, if I had never been involved in a writer's conference, excuse me, I don't think anything would have happened. Because up until 1984, I wrote basically in isolation. Mm-hmm. Then in 1983, divorce. I thought, might as well get out there and check out the world, and I started going to workshops, going to writing groups, and I'd been writing for years, of course, and I'd had several things published in magazines, but it was just me and whoever the editor was of the magazine. We didn't know each other from Adam, and if I got lucky, I got lucky.
So I want to ask you, I'm glad you mentioned that, the value in going to workshops and conferences. we get that question sometimes, through email and through social media posts about that and where to go and that sort of thing. But the value as a writer for what you get out of going to those. Can you talk a little bit about that and why those are important?
Yes. Excuse me. If I can talk about it from both sides, as a participant and as a workshop teacher. The workshop for a lot of people is really going to be the only chance they have to impress an editor. I've been amazingly lucky, knock on wood. I've been a very lucky hillbilly in that I have never had to approach an editor or a publisher to ask them to publish a book of mine. They've come to me because I'd be at a workshop with other people, and other people would have the same luck. I would see it over and over again, and they would like what they heard or what they'd read, and they would ask me to send them something. I was in one workshop, the Appalachian Writers Workshop down in Houchin, Kentucky, and the late, great Charlie Hughes. I was whining about never being able to get a book published in my own country. I'd already had 2 or 3 books published in Ireland, but I couldn't get one published here. And he said, I'll publish your book. So bingo. My first American book was Among Wordless Things. It just happened to win the Appalachian Book of the Year for 2004. So how much luckier can I get? I just don't know.
Yeah. So a lot of it is about, putting yourself out there, but it's about networking too, I would assume, getting to know people and developing those relationships.
In my early days, I was very naive and maybe purist about it. I thought, if it's good, it'll get noticed, it'll get out there. No, there's a lot of people who just, I'm sure, never get anything because they're shy or they don't have contacts or they're poor, really poor maybe, and they get ignored. Who knows what happens to those manuscripts.
Yeah.
So.
Interesting, very good. I want to ask you about another poem that I really liked of yours, Last Night, 5 Young Owls.
Oh, yeah.
And I love how you, going back to the bird theme from earlier with the crows, I love how you kind of open that. You write about the owls, came sidestepping onto a high limb to test their question on the moon, the river under blue light, and the clouds that cluttered the hills around the horizon. Tell us a little bit about that poem and owls and what kind of attracted you to them and to writing about them.
I've always been kind of a night person. It seems like, for years I wanted to be a cat. I would roam around at night, just all the time. And so what are you going to run into at night besides cats? The occasional dog and owls. And, of course, I love the idea of playing with the idea that the owl is supposed to say who. Right, well, that's their question, right? As the 5 young owls come sidestepping out onto the limb, testing their question on the night, they're saying who in their little voices. And that actual incident was described to me by a neighbor. He said, yeah, last night there were these 5 young owls, and I just started the wheels rolling. You never know what's going to start a poem to go. It can be something you see, something you hear. I used to have a couple tricks that I did. I would listen to the radio, but in the old days when you could tune the radio by the dial, not digitally, I would turn the dial just slightly off the station so that what I was hearing was distorted. And I would just listen to what they were saying, but I would misunderstand all of it. But some of the weirdest phrases would come to me. I would think I was hearing it, but of course it would be the wrong phrase, and that would give me an idea, and I would just start writing something down from that and go from there. It's all about what will trigger the imagination and make us feel like we have to reply to it.
Yeah,
we got to respond to this thing that we saw or heard. So.
Very good, and you there's definitely some response going on there with Last Night, 5 Young Owls, and I love how you end the poem too. The hollow night, the open nest, or glowing dilated eyes. The sense of that last look or that last kind of silent exchange you might be having with the owls.
Yeah.
I really like that poem a whole lot.
Thank you.
Let me ask you to take us through a typical writing day for you. What is that like? Do you write every day? And if you do, are you working on poems, or do you kind of go back and forth from poems to short stories, or what's a writing day like for Ron Houchin?
That's an interesting question. Since I retired in 2001, I've been retired for 17 years, so I'm the poster boy for retiring. I knew when I retired there were all these things I wanted to do. It wasn't like I was going to go fishing for 6 months or play with grandchildren for a couple of years. I knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to work, I wanted to write, and I wanted to travel. Before I retired, I wrote just about as much as I do now, but I did it by the method I told you about. That I would make an assignment for a class, or somebody in the class would suggest it. And I turned all of my classes, no matter what the topic was, I turned them all into writing classes because I knew that's what they really needed, which meant they were also reading classes. And so then I would write in class. I would write before class. I'd write after class. I'd write whenever it struck me. I don't carry a pen around with me. I don't carry paper. Most writers do. I've decided that the muse, the old idea that this inspiration comes from magical places, and it may well do. I've always felt like the muse is probably capricious, loves to catch you off guard. So I'll be sitting in a restaurant. If an idea comes to me, I'll borrow the waiter's pen and I'll take a napkin and turn it over. I don't hesitate. If I'm heading home from the Y, and I get an idea, I'll just pull over and write. Pop a notebook out of the glove compartment or pick up a sheet of paper or whatever, write inside a book, back leaf, and put it down. After I retired, that all got a little more intense, at the same time a little more relaxed, in that I didn't have to get up at 6:30 every morning and haul off to school, and get everything ready and be try to get in a little bit of writing and then get and the classes would start and so forth. I get up about 8:30, 8:30 depending. Eat breakfast, do the usual morning ablutions, and then I'll start writing. I'll get stuff out from the day before and look at it, get going. If it's prose, then I'll read what I wrote the day before and to see if I get the wheels turning again. If nothing like that happens, I read. That's always the fallback. If you're a writer, you've got to read because that's what spins the wheels,
Yeah.
And then I'll revise. I spend a lot of time revising and sending stuff out, because nobody's going to want to send it out for you for long unless you want to pay a fortune to an agent or something like that. And there's generally not enough money in poetry for an agent to be really very interested. So the money in poetry seems to come from doing workshops and doing readings and selling books and things like that. So I'll do that, and at about 1 o'clock I'll stop, go to the Y. For me, diet and exercise are just about as important as reading, because I've noticed we're hunters. For thousands of years we were hunters. So if we stay a little bit hungry, so I make a point of not overeating ever. I'm always a little under-satisfied as far as that goes, and that keeps me looking at things and looking. That hunter instinct comes out. And then after I get down at the Y around 3 o'clock or so, this is the part that I probably shouldn't say. I go home and play video games or watch horror films or visit friends, or whatever. I allow myself to get relaxed, And I'm retired, so each week for me is 6 Saturdays and a Sunday. So I'm making the most of it.
Very good, Andrew. I want to ask you too about you've transitioned a little bit. We mentioned at the beginning we were talking about you have these 8 books of poetry, but you've also done short stories and a novella. Making that transition from writing poetry to short fiction or short stories to novellas, what was that like, or do you find that as you were talking a moment ago about kind of reading to keep the gears moving, do you find writing in those other genres helps you with your poetry, or how does all that work? How jumping genres like that?
Yeah, that is interesting. I'd always written essays and articles from time to time, but not for long periods of time. To write that collection of short stories, that was a little bit easier than poetry because I could just recollect the stories that I'd told the students. And I tried to tell those stories in the same way that I'd told them, which meant a little wordy, in the oral tradition. Instead of more in the literary tradition, I wanted them to sound like they were being told out loud. That was interesting. That took me back because I didn't write that collection until I'd been retired for several years. But it was a whole different kind of experience, especially in that it takes huge blocks of time. Prose, short stories, novel, they just take so much time. You have to have this kind of uncluttered time. I see why so many novelists wind up divorced, male or female, because it's just, who wants to put up with that? That time where you're just absent. You've got to do it. And it's different also. It's not just in a physical way like the time period, but it's also different in a mental way. Like I said, I have to sort of be in love to write a poem. I have to be in love with some aspect of the world. I have to see this thing that talks to me, and I want to respond to it. For prose, no, I can be having a very sour day and I can still bang out a story, because the story lives in some separate place apart from emotion, like in memory, I suppose, at least for me. And in poetry, you have to write word by word. You have to write line. The unit of the poem is the line. It's the line, the sound. So you look at units of sound and how they work together, and you're writing basically word by word. With prose, whether it's short story or novel, you can just kind of bang out whole blocks of time, whole blocks of writing, and that takes time. I mean, to write 10,000 words a day in prose is going to take a chunk of time.
Very good. Interesting. So, Ron, in our final moments with you here today, if someone wants to get in contact with you to talk to you about your 8 books of poetry or talk to you about writing, how can they do that, and where can they get copies of your poetry or your short stories or your novella?
Well, I have a Facebook page. Just be facebook.com/Ron Houchin. Bingo. I check it every day, so they can message me or leave a note there, and I would get back to them. That'd be the simplest way.
Okay.
As far as the availability of the books, they're all available on Amazon except the novella. The novella is only available, it's called The Devil's Trill. It's only available from Main Street Rag. That's a Charlotte, North Carolina publisher. For some reason, he doesn't like to put things up on Amazon. Maybe he doesn't like to make money. I don't know what it is, but he just doesn't put them up there. So that'd be the best ways. But all the others, and on Barnes and Noble,
Okay.
and at the publishers. Go to winpublications.com or salmonpoetry.com or LSU Press, and they'd send to you. Or come to a reading. If I'm to give in a reading, come there, because I can promise you that I'll be selling them cheaper than you can get them online with the postage and everything else. So.
Very good. Excellent. Ron Houchin has been our guest here today on Chapters. He's the author of 8 books of poetry, 1 novella, 1 collection of short stories. He's a Weatherford Award winning author and has also received numerous awards, both nationally and internationally, for his poetry and his work. Ron, it's been a pleasure having you on the program. We appreciate you coming on, and delightful to talk to you about your career. And as you keep writing and keep publishing, we'll have you back on to talk about it. So thanks so much.
Excellent, Eliot. Thank you.
We also want to take a moment to say thanks to Chris Dargish and the staff and management of Empire Books and News for providing our on-site support and assistance today. We encourage you to come down to Empire Books and News and inquire about Ron's poetry books, his novella, or his short stories. And also remind you that many of the authors, editors, and publishers you've seen featured on the program have their works for sale right here at Empire Books and News. So come on down to Pullman Square and get whatever reading taste you need satisfied right here at Empire Books and News. And we appreciate their sponsorship of our program each and every episode here on Chapters. And one of the best benefits of our program is that we have an opportunity to interact frequently with you, our audience. And many of you have done that, and many of you have taken advantage of the platforms that we have available for you to stay in touch with what's going on here on Chapters. If you're interested in reaching out to us, one of the first ways to do that is through email, and the email address is right here at the bottom of the screen. It's Armstrong, it's lp4@zoominternet.net. We please ask that you write your name and the city or community in which you're writing from so that we can keep track of that correspondence. If you like to view programs on YouTube, we've made that possible to you and for you through the Armstrong One Wire page on YouTube, and that address is right here at the bottom of the screen. When you put that into your search browser, look for the Chapters tab, and we've got all of our author, editor, and publisher interviews archived for you right there on the YouTube page. And we even have a page on Facebook, so if you like to use Facebook, we have a Facebook page, and that address is right here at the bottom of the screen. What you'll find on the Facebook page is our more recent author, editor, and publisher interviews archived for you there. You can interact with viewers of the program, comment on that, interact with others who have shared those posts, share that post on your Facebook page or any other page that you may belong to get those interviews out and spreading around through social media. So we know many of you do that and take advantage of that, and we appreciate all the comments and feedback that we do receive through one of those social media platforms. So please keep those comments and feedback coming. And that's going to do it for us this time on Chapters, but please come again next time. And in the meantime, stay tuned to this station for news and views that impact you and your community.